Hi there, I'm Dan. I'm an investor at Excel, and I'm lucky enough to be on the boards of Sentry and Vercel. So I'm thrilled to be at Next.js Conf with David Cramer, the founder and CTO at Sentry. And we're going to do a little walk down memory lane. But first, I'll let David introduce himself maybe a little bit.
I'm exactly what Dan said, a founder and CTO at Sentry, which mostly means I once wrote a lot of code, and I play administrative assistant mostly, but have lots of strong opinions. So
I too once wrote code, and now we're both useless. But we're also getting old. I always joke about this. You know, it's obvious with me. I look old and I'm bald. But David's old thing is he's now becoming an amateur astronomer. So plug for a Noe Valley astronomer on Instagram. You guys should all check it out and just make fun of David ceaselessly about it, which is great.
Yeah.
What I want to do during this is we're going to talk about Next in the context of delivering great end user experience and great developer ergonomics. But we're going to do it by comparing it to like when we showed up in the industry and what it looked like. So we're going to do a little walk down memory lane, and then we'll talk a little about the current state of affairs that's getting better every day, and maybe some of the things we need going forward. Okay, take me back. I'm David Cramer. It's the early 2000s. Where am I? I'm in Kansas, and I'm building web apps. What does the tech stack look like for a developer building web apps then?
It's close, Nebraska, but
Nebraska. It's the same.
I'm a self-taught engineer, so it means I still today don't know what I'm doing, and so this is probably wrong. But I remember early on, I would open up, some kind of editor, probably on a server, probably through an FTP connection, and I would copy index.php into index2.php, and I'd make my changes there, and I'd see if the website still loaded. And usually it didn't for the first 10 times. And so then you just keep going until it compiles and you've got a new feature. But mostly it was accessible. I just had to log into the server and, it's deployed instantly.
Totally. I remember when I was first getting into this, I had a Mac and I downloaded MAMP, which was the Mac version of the LAMP stack. And I could just start editing index.php and then saving. And I would see like a local server version and it would work. And it was awesome because it was super, super easy. And then my first web job, we worked on a product doing it, and we were a small team, and it was incredible. You'd FTP things, no version control whatsoever.
Yeah.
And it was kind of the glory days. And the cool thing was, as a developer, you were just like text editing. I mean, maybe using an editor like Eclipse or what was back in I don't know. There was weird things back in the day.
Text.
BlueJ for Java. There was weird stuff.
Edit plus or text edit plus.
Eventually TextMate, but that was later.
TextMate was later.
So it was really cool. And then the problems came up. So this is the early 2000s, and some of the biggest websites in the world get built in PHP. So first, there's like Yahoo in the late 90s, and then Facebook and Etsy and things like that. But you get bigger, and you run into some problems with PHP. So what are some of the challenges of that? So maybe it's easy to get started as a developer, but what are some of the roadblocks you would hit as a developer, and also maybe as delivering the experience for end users?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is just like kind of how the scope of tech has evolved. So index.php, all your code's in one file. Maybe you included some other files, but you're basically building a framework at that point. And so I think what actually happened is PHP was kind of fine. Maybe it had some problems, but it was kind of fine. It's still in use today, like big frameworks, right? But it was more we didn't have fast ways to get the actual thing we wanted to do done. So I remember, I started Django 0.95 or something a few years after I learned to write terrible PHP. And the delta was I could create basically an HTML page and drop in a little widget that had comments. And it wasn't like a third-party service. It was just a locally, fully encapsulated, rendered comments widget. And Rails had the same kind of thing. And so all of a sudden it was, instead of building like endless boilerplate code, like, okay, they abstracted a bunch of things for you.
Right.
And I think that had to happen just because the scope of the internet was bigger. There were more kinds of things going on, like more kinds of products, more depth to the products, I guess. And so I think, and I'm sure bigger companies had some of this even back in our terrible PHP days. But that was the big delta for me. It was just like technology became more complex because it was trying to do more things.
Yeah, organizations were getting bigger, and PHP, with the freedom of it, was you could do whatever you like. And the downside is you were, the joke was always it was just spaghetti code. You were kind of tying things together and stitching stuff together. And all of a sudden, the mid-2000s roll around. And this is, to me, at least the era of Django, and Rails probably was prominent. I was a Rails developer briefly at Crunchbase. And you had this new thing. So with PHP, you basically downloaded LAMP or MAMP and you just got running. And in Rails and Django, you basically started to develop this concept of norms, and a build step kind of concept showed up. Heroku became a thing with build packs. And so now, as you alluded to, you could build bigger projects. And you worked on Django closely. That's actually the origins of Sentry. Was as a tool for Django. And so the upsides here, you get this developer productivity, organization scale a little bit better. But what were some of the downsides of that approach from a developer experience perspective and maybe a user?
Yeah, I think you kind of nailed it with just Heroku. Like Heroku had to exist. Is
Right.
like that's the inevitable outcome. Like you had to have some kind of, if not a build process, you had to have some way to get the code into production to run it in a different kind of environment. Because like PHP, the file just executes in real time, kind of compiles on the fly or caches on the fly. Python doesn't do that. Rails doesn't do that. And so you had an intermediate server all of a sudden, which meant you added on all this other complexity, I guess. And Heroku build packs, or Heroku in general, I don't know if it was the first. I actually don't think it was the first. But it was certainly the most popular way to not have those problems. Because I just remember all of a sudden it's like, you go from I just have to put the files in the right place on the server for them to execute to I actually have to configure a server entirely, right? Like it's wildly different outcome, I guess.
Yeah, and all these things develop around that. So this is the era of like Git to deploy, and more Git stuff. GitHub shows up around this time, which kind of seminal stuff. We're using more open source. I remember, PHP when I was using it didn't really have like a package management tool of note. I mean, eventually I think Composer, right? And Python, this was like a big war early on.
Is a big war.
Is still a big war about that. And there was like virtual environments for Python. I remember coming from the PHP world. I was like, what is going on? It's like really hard to get started. But then you would get into it, and it got easier. Like it just made more sense. You could iterate a lot faster as a developer. You could take advantage of all these great tools, but you had downsides. But you were building large, complex web apps, which was really exciting. And then all of a sudden, and by the way, this actually we should note, this is like what spawned Sentry, which I think is a great story. So all this is going on. Django exists is getting popular. Heroku shows up and is getting popular. At the time, there are these old school error logging tools that exist primarily in the Ruby ecosystem. You build Sentry in the Python and Django ecosystem originally, and people from Heroku show up and say, would you like to be in our marketplace? And you say, sure. And then they're like, okay, you have to run a service, right? You have to offer a service and be accessible via an API, and that's the birth of Sentry as a service in kind of a really cool way.
Yeah. Got tricked on that one.
Yeah, a little bit of a bait and switch. And I remember the days of the Heroku Marketplace. That's a thing. But at the same time as this is going on, and this is like a seminal moment for everyone in tech, in 2007, right, the iPhone comes out or something. In 2008, the App Store comes out. And all of a sudden, people start building mobile apps.
Yep.
And the way I always thought about mobile apps was you're building the app that sits on the phone first, and the services are kind of in service of that, right? All the third-party stuff. And that's exemplified by the approach like a Parse would take, where, you're an iOS developer, you don't know much about backend servers. We kind of, give you a version of that. But I think one of the key moments about it was, in the earliest days of the web, I remember this like seminally, like you would navigate and a whole page refreshes.
Yeah.
And I think technically Internet Explorer gets credit. 99 Ajax comes out. And then the first app we all probably experienced using it was Gmail in 2004 and Google Calendar. And they're these great apps. But now the iPhone comes out and every consumer wants that. Every consumer sits there and says, I want an interactive app. And they're like, well, we got to build this thing. But the web then wasn't, I remember, and actually I should give a shout out to Guillermo for this from Vercel. So then, I remember in the mid-2000s, you were using jQuery. I think it came out in 2006, 2007, John Ressig. And there was MooTools, which is why I'm giving the shout out to Guillermo, which was the other thing besides jQuery. And that was, I think, Guillermo's first big purview into open source was being a MooTools core contributor. But they weren't really made to create great experiences. They were kind of delightful little front-end ties. And so now people said, how do we create iOS-like experiences, end-user great on the web? And at the same time, React comes out from Facebook. And there's other approaches. There's Angular. There's other things that do a flavor of this. And there's Objective-J and Cappuccino for the JavaScript nerds out there, which I'm a huge fan of. And so this stuff comes out, but it's hard to use. It's a totally new paradigm. All of a sudden now you have front end, you have back end, you have builds, you have weird flows. Front end engineers hadn't historically been the kinds of engineers who would use a system like React. Pete Hunt famously mocks them accidentally for a while on stage. They get very mad at him. Sorry, Pete. And that gets us into the mid-2000s in the world of what eventually became Next. React is hard to use. Next, much like maybe Flask and Python, is it's a simple way to get started. Building on React, building rich front ends. It's the first thing that's okay, you can build a mobile web-like thing. But now all the services, dev tools, dev experiences, broken again with React. Now we're in the world of JavaScript bundlers and stuff, right? So take me through, and this actually now Sentry, the company, comes into play, because I remember when Sentry made a huge bet on JavaScript, both internally building our tool, and we load an obnoxious amount of JavaScript. We have a great loading screen for that, but also with kind of our SDK support we focus on. So take me to like what you thought about developer experience and user experience in kind of those early 2000s, mid 2000s.
Yeah.
The beginning of Next, but maybe.
So I think there's some like misnomers. So I think the mobile's always been like a bolt-on. Like everybody bet on it back in the day, but it's still like a bolt-on. Like nobody actually cares about mobile as like a core business product. Yes, everybody invests in it, but it's not like Walmart.com is just as important as the Walmart app, right? Like it's basically just how do we put Walmart.com into the mobile app. That's actually what's become reality, right? And I think obviously the interactive experiences were important, but I think the gap along the way is like engineering. We like to, over-engineer is the simplest way to put it. We like to like, oh, there's a cool idea and let's take it to the extreme, which is always bad. So we're still in the extreme version of JavaScript is going to be my analogy. Dependencies were a problem. So NPM comes along, makes dependencies easy. Now we have thousands of dependencies. I run NPM install, my machine lights on fire. So we like to take it to the extreme.
The famous left pad.
Yeah. Yeah, lots of problems with it. So I think we're still immature in that regard. But I think the interesting thing is some of the technology's changed. So even how like Vercel works, a lot of it is just like caching. It's CDN. It's not like new ideas. It's done slightly differently, but it's like old style ideas that have existed for decades, right? It's like, how do we make the experience fast and pleasant for customers? And generally you do that by bringing the customers closer to the code.
Yeah.
Now the problem with bringing the customers close to the code is bandwidth and latency are not a solved problem in the world. Like, it seems great here in San Francisco. We got fiber in our apartment buildings and everything, but like, I don't know, you go to rural Africa or India or something, and it's like, good luck loading half of our web applications.
I still remember we worked at Dropbox together, and I remember when we did a big partnership with Samsung, which is in South Korea. And so we're in South Korea, and somebody loads Dropbox, and it takes forever. And we were all shocked by this. We were like, "What?" And it was a painful moment.
It's that bias that everybody forgets about. And so, like in Sentry, we're guilty of this. Our bundle size is probably a few megs, and that's why we show this obnoxious loading indicator, because we're like,
which I love, by the way.
We're just honest about our failures, right? And so I think Next is interesting, and I think there's a long ways to go for this kind of technology, but it's interesting because it tries to change the compromise, I guess, a little bit. So the way I do the analogy, so Sentry, we always talk about, Sentry's purpose is not to prevent bugs. You can't prevent software bugs. Mm-hmm. But the whole purpose of like sort of software toolchain is to accelerate software. It's basically, how do we ship more code and ideally break less things and just do that as fast as possible? And so Sentry kind of plays that balance. And I think Next is kind of doing that a little bit in the sense of like, we want those fast user experiences, but we don't want to download 10 megs of JavaScript just to have it, which, for some cases, maybe that's okay. But for many, that's too much. And I think it's interesting, but I think there's still a lot of unsolved problems in the industry. Like my classic example, and actually even Sentry's perfect analogy of this is like, you ship a bunch of JavaScript code, something goes wrong, you don't have logs. Okay, so we built Sentry to solve that problem. You don't have metrics. You don't have any of these other tooling paradigms that exist for server-based code, or even to some degree mobile apps, but they don't have any of this either, right? And we're doing performance monitoring now. You don't actually have performance monitoring for JavaScript. And more so, what is performance monitoring? Yeah. What is performance? And so we have web vitals, and who knows if they're useful. And there's all these things going on. And so I think it's still in a rapid state of change, and it's been that way for a good 5 years now, I would say. And it's probably another 5 years till we figure some things out, I would say.
Oh, I think it'll keep changing. I mean, I like this. Like, so we were really old doing that PHP stuff. Then I remember the first time I used Subversion. And one of the downsides of Subversion as a version control system for those folks who haven't had the joy of using it is it created like a blocker. You had this huge challenge of like you had to like get your pull request or whatever accepted, and somebody would own the Subversion and tell you no, this, no, that, whatever. And we moved to a world of Git where it became a little more distributed. Commits became more atomic, so I could do smaller and smaller pushes or kind of pull requests. I could accomplish a lot, but of course that created its own world, which I think of as like the GitHub marketplace, where it's like every pull refresh now has like 15 badges of something going on. There's like a linting thing, and your code coverage, and you're running your tests, and you're doing all these things. But no one wants that. I don't mean that in a negative way, but like nobody really wants those things. But what any developer wants is like, I want to just push something as quickly as I can in the smallest way possible to production. Yeah. And sometimes I want that to be to an end user. But even if I want to just do like internal testing or show it to a colleague, I just want a real URL that's running in prod.
Yeah.
And so, in the mid 2000s, when you have that Rails Django stuff, like testing became a huge deal. Like things like Circle CI grow up. But the reason Sentry exists is you're not going to catch everything testing pre-prod. It's just going to happen. You need great monitoring in production. You have no choice. And now Next and Vercel really move things in a great way towards now it's easy to get a deploy URL. So now it's not just easy to have a pull request. You have an easy deploy URL, which is awesome because as a developer, you can push more and more stuff faster and faster, and it's live. It's like real. Now you can show it to your team, and then you can show it to others. But the problem is, just like we need to do a lot of stuff on tests and whatever it is, and testing and prod, now you have way more effectively releases. You have way more code out there. You're showing some stuff internally, some stuff to a canary set of users, some just everyone. And you need monitoring systems that work for that, right? And not just monitoring systems, by the way, like A/B testing is now trivial. It used to be much more complicated how you're setting up an A/B test, and it's not clear everyone needs them all the time. But yeah, it'd be nice if you could just, instead of just having a branch, you have literally a deployed URL where you can test, you can do A/B testing, you can optimize page, you can do personalization. But as all this happens, your complexity grows, and you need guardrails. You need to know like what's going on with that system, and that's where things like Sentry come in, which is, it's great that we can do more stuff faster. That's the right move for a developer. It makes a developer's life better. But that developer also wants to know, like, how's it going? How does that affect my users now that I'm pushing? I remember like in the early 2010s, everyone was like talking about, people were bragging about how many deploys they would do a day. It was like a whole thing. And that continues to spike massively. But the more and more deploys you do to different segments, the more you need telemetry, monitoring to understand what's going on.
I think it's just the cycle of technology.
Yeah.
And take microservices. Nobody talks about them anymore because it's broken. You can argue with me, but it's a broken model.
Sure.
And it's not any different than service architectures. Now, analogy to today is like, cool, we have some of these awesome developer workflows. We can ship this front-end code really fast. It's a distributed system. Nobody knows how it works. And so I think there's this interesting, and it's the same as like the monitoring or the testing or anything. We kind of solve a problem or we push the boundaries and we break everything along the way, and you got to go back and fix everything. And so I think the interesting things for me are less about like, can we do A/B testing more easily or anything? Because it's something I've never cared about. But I actually think the idea that we can safely test is more interesting. Because I've always been like, when I overlapped with Dan at Dropbox, I was working on dev tooling or dev infrastructure. And so a lot of my investment was CI and CD. I didn't own the CD part, but it was really about like, is the code stable? Can it be deployed quickly? That's always been my goal as a developer. And the interesting challenge was always like, can you make the CI environment at least test that it's going to work in production?
Yep.
Your dev M is never going to be production. You just can't solve that problem. But can you do that? And there's an interesting idea, and this is kind of Sentry's thesis, is if you can monitor the code, ignore the systems because systems don't matter. Like you can't control Vercel servers or anything, right? You can't control the CDN, the devices that code's running on. So ignore the servers. You control the code. So if something goes wrong, you got to be able to change the code. So that's kind of our premise with Sentry. And then the interesting aspect of how the world's changing is something like Vercel, you can deploy two versions side by side very seamlessly. It's roughly the same architecture. You don't have to build any of that scaffolding. You can do it with Heroku and stuff like that, of course, too. But it's like more people are invested in this model now. So you deploy version A and version B, Sentry can monitor both and tell you if version A and version B are like, dope. Like, are they different? Is one better? Is one worse? Like, did you create new bugs? Are more things slow? All this stuff. And it's not like a groundbreaking idea, but the technology's finally getting there where, blue-green builds and stuff like this are becoming much more mainstream. Whereas like 10 years ago, this was like a great idea that we could not execute on.
Yeah,
at least not well.
People have talked about test and production for a long time as a concept, but it was just harder to do because there was always like a little bit of a gap between staging dev and prod. Yeah. And with a thing like Vercel, you get better and closer to that. You get closer to like, hey, these are basically the same as provided Vercel is doing everything the same. And now we can really do that easily. So it's great for developer. Okay, so now we've talked about where we are today, but you mentioned JavaScript in the world of web technology and web app technology always changes. I always think as like a former app developer once upon a time, what I want is, I kind of just want everyone to get out of my way and let me work as quickly as possible, right? So I remember like I always hated the guy who ran the Subversion repo. And like that for me was what like distributed version control was like, it made it easier for me to like do commits locally and then push them. And yeah, maybe we'll still have code reviews and things like that, but it really made it a lot easier. You didn't have to go through so many manual things. It was all automated. I think, deployments is a good example of this. Like, well, this whole concept of going from dev to prod, like a deployment was a big deal.
Yeah. And
now something like Vercel, it's not as big a deal. But what are other things, like imagine this paradigm continues forward and you're a developer and you want no one getting in your way. You want like no ops, not just DevOps. where are there still bottlenecks to developer in the world of Next that people need to work on? And I have some ideas, but I'd love to hear those.
So when you pitch VCs, I'm told you're supposed to link up a bunch of stuff, grand ideas. So I remember when we were trying to reverse engineer our mission and focus kind of stuff, the hypothesis was going back to that canary thing. It's like, well, what if you could run version 1, version 2, and you could fully shadow traffic on both? Hopefully it's not over everybody's head, but so somebody hits walmart.com, that exact traffic goes to beta.walmart.com or something like that, right? Same code bases or same infrastructure, different code. Mm-hmm. Customer sees version 1 that's stable, but the monitoring system sees version 2. And so then you basically got free QA, right? Like it's fully automated, machine-driven QA. The tools can figure out if something's wrong. That is a really interesting idea. The reality is databases are not that easy to work with. And even if you use something like Next today or Vercel or even Heroku, like Heroku tried, but like where's the database live? It's a stateful machine. It requires complex security and authentication. Like there's 15 different databases at any given moment in time that you want to use, and like there's not really third-party services to host them, and even if there are, they're not inside your cloud, so latency is a problem. So there's like state is still a problem.
Yeah.
So even though like CDN is a CDN, it works phenomenally well. We can make it faster and faster and faster, but state is the problem.
Yeah.
And I don't see that changing anytime in the near future. And I know there's a lot of investment around services, but if you've ever tried to use Firebase, it's not fun. The database, the NoSQL database, is impossible to write securely, like the rules and stuff behind it. And so it's like an interesting academic idea, but I just don't see anything coming anytime soon.
I think the state's. I mean, I always think about one of the examples I remember, and I was never a very good developer, by the way, so it should be disclaimer. But I remember the first time I had to care about like connections in a database, and I still think to myself, like, why is that like a thing? Like, I know why it matters, but like most developers shouldn't have to think about connections, and that's still a huge issue, and it's even exacerbated in kind of the world of front end, where on a front end developer you have way more connections potentially. It's a huge challenge. There's security issues, but there's also just like too many connection problems. And there's got to be a way to kind of deal with that, whether it's middleware or databases that kind of incorporate that. I think one of the coolest things about things like Vercel and Next and this like kind of CDN caching model you mentioned is, you get the data everywhere the users are, you get the app everywhere the users are, but now you're sitting there and you're still waiting for data to load from US East or something in Northern Virginia, even though it's cool that your app's somewhere else. So there's like a lot to be solved there. I also think there's a lot of opportunities. You mentioned the shadow traffic example. One thing the most sophisticated companies do that I think is a huge opportunity is, everyone hates long builds. Nobody like a huge part of this is if you're going to do builds and pushes and deploys every time, you don't want your builds to take forever. And you can do a bunch of like statistical ML analysis on like what tests do I need to run. If you have a massive failed test, you just want to make sure that test runs first. And there's lots of ways you can kind of intuit that. But one is like based on like kinds of traffic that you're getting. One is based on prior tests that fail. One's based on what part of the code base you're doing. And the biggest, most sophisticated companies like Google and Facebook do this. But there's a huge opportunity for it to be done for everyone else. And a lot of it is like, do we have like unified tool set? Do we have unified application frameworks? Do we have great build systems? And so I think there's a lot of...
I mean, it goes back to tool chain. It's like we change a tech and we have to reinvent all the tooling along the way. Now, the problem usually is the people reinventing it did not invent the first version, and so they're relearning all the same mistakes. This was a big pet peeve of mine when like Node and JavaScript was up and coming. You had people inventing like logging libraries. And they're like, well, we don't need log levels. It doesn't even make any sense. And these people had never written like server-side code before, right? And then, over time they figure out like, oh, maybe we need to introduce log levels, or we need to introduce named loggers, or all these other things. I'm like, there's prior art. You could have just like tried to understand why it exists, And so I think even like the build systems and stuff, that's kind of the thing. And it's nonstop stuff has to change and adapt along the way, right? And like every few years, there's some cool new idea, which is important. It's innovation, but there's the cost of every new idea. And actually, I think this is React's strength. Like there was Angular, there was Ember, there was React. We wrote Sentry in all three of those, the front end. We stuck with React. And we stuck with React because it was the least compromise. Like it was not super opinionated. It was very fast. It did everything we needed it to do. And it was run by a big organization that wasn't going anywhere. Facebook, you can love them or hate them, but they've contributed a lot of great stuff. So, and I think React's great. And I hope things like React stick around. But I think things like React are so great because they're based in like the fundamentals of the problem that needs to be solved versus like, here's a fun, shiny, cool idea, right? And I think, Next does a lot of this cool stuff. But I think Next challenge is like, I've got to build my app differently than I'm used to, which is like Ember and Angular's challenge, to be fair, too. Now, Next doesn't compromise in the same way that they do. But I think it's still like, you've got to change how you're building the app, which means you got to change how you test the app, how you monitor. Like, the whole life cycle changes. And it's like, I think they'll converge, to be fair, at some point, and everything ends up looking the same if it succeeds over time. And I think part of the attraction is the technology moves us forward in sort of solving some of these experiences, and we get to solve some of the problems along the way, which gives you the option to rethink things. But the consequence is, like, it doesn't necessarily work for everything yet. Like, there's a lot of problems that are... the database thing is the real problem. Like, if you want to build something like Sentry, you could probably build it in Next.js. You probably couldn't build it on Vercel, however.
Not yet.
Because you need the database. The
Right.
database has to be lightning fast, right? So I think it's like, works for some things, doesn't work for others, but that's totally fine as well.
Yeah, and it's a big opportunity for folks to do more of these third-party services and things like that around it. So there's a huge shift happening, and there's lots to do. Well, anyways, David, thank you so much for sitting down and talking about this stuff. It's super valuable. And everyone should go check out Noe Valley Astronomer, and feel free to troll David about it. But it's some pretty cool stuff.
I have no idea what I'm doing. So.
He's doing a great job. All right. See you later.